History of Poland podcast, episode 38, Long-Term Consequences. Hello and welcome back. Last time we left off with the death of Leszek the White at the hands of the now Duke of Pomerania. That now Duke part was a direct result of the assassination of Leszek the White. That assassination, known to us as the Gosawa massacre, would have some serious consequences. Unfortunately, for the very idea of Polish stability, there was no clear line of succession, which will lead to some immediate problems, this being one of the chief consequences of that assassination. Among those problems is, of course, who is going to become Grand Duke, and the associated question, who is going to get Krakow? Now, before we jump back into events, we need to quickly review who the PS are that are still alive at this time. First, there's Konrad, who is Leszek's brother and the Duke of Mazovia. Next, there's Henry the Bearded, who was the Duke of Silesia. Last time we heard about how Henry tried to rise up against Leszek, and instead became good friends with him. That friendship with Leszek was not automatically transferred to Konrad. Then there's a guy named Władysław Spindleshanks, who ruled over the territories surrounding Gniezno. Those are the people with official status, but there are others with less official status, but no less important roles. One of these people is Leszek's widow, Grzmislawa, who wields considerable influence due to the fact that she is the mother of Leszek's heir, Bolesław, who is still an infant at this time. In addition to that role in court, she was also related to the ruling dynasty in Kiev, which certainly added to her prestige. So those are the main characters we need to be up to date on. But what are they doing following the death of Leszek? For that, we turn to Jan Długosz, who gives us the rundown of the spillover, telling us that, quote, "The murder of Leszek leads to strife between the surviving dukes, Konrad of Mazovia, Leszek's brother, and Henry the Bearded, Duke of Silesia and Wrocław, both of whom strive to assume the authority of monarch and the guardianship of Leszek's children. Disgusted by Konrad's tyrannical behavior, Leszek's widow, Grzmislawa, places herself, her children, and their duchies and lands under the protection and rule of Duke Henry, begging him to protect them from Konrad. The result is civil war, with each of the two advancing on Krakow with an army. Grzmislawa has possession of the castle and city and denies them to Konrad. Henry builds 2 new forts and installs strong garrisons in them, hoping that these will enable him to occupy the whole duchy. Konrad, considering that for him victory depends on the destruction of these 2 forts, brings up an army to lay siege to that at Skala. Henry bars his advance, and there is a fierce battle in which Konrad's young son, Przemysl, is killed, and which ends in Konrad retreating, leaving Henry the victor. Konrad now marches on the second fort, but fares no better there, and having lost most of his men, takes refuge in the nearby forest. He then returns to Mazovia in order to get reinforcements and start all over again. But, seeing that his troops are reluctant and not well disciplined, and also that summer is nearly over, he abandons the use of force in favor of deceit and cunning, which he hopes will make it easier for him to defeat his enemy. Henry, thinking that he has defeated his opponent, sends his son back to Silesia with the army, while he, carefree, sets off on a tour of the Duchy of Krakow, convinced that the peasants are all his sincere and loyal subjects. Learning of this, Konrad returns to Krakow, and with the help of a few discontented knights, pounces upon Henry while he is hearing mass in a church in Spichkowski, and carries him off to a castle in Mazovia. Henry's son, also Henry, assembles a large army of both his own people and mercenaries with which to invade Mazovia should Konrad refuse to release his father. The Duchess Grzmislawa, in an attempt to avoid the slaughter, depopulation, devastation, and oppression of peasants and the poor that would otherwise occur, herself goes to Mazovia to prevent civil war. In her presence, Konrad is like one defeated and promises to do what she asks. Thus, Konrad and Henry are reconciled. The bond is strengthened by Konrad's 2 sons marrying 2 of the Duchess's granddaughters. Henry is released and returns to Silesia. Konrad now considers himself monarch and guardian of Leszek's 2 sons, despite the opposition of their mother." End quote. That was a lot of information, so let's go through and dissect it a bit. First, we hear that following the death of Leszek, everyone decided to scramble for power. Aside from the immediate implications for all parties involved, this would also have long-term repercussions for the Polish polity, which are not to be ignored. Up until this time, the ruler of Krakow and the title of Grand Duke were at least nominally tied to the testament of Bolesław. As we've mentioned a few times, this testament was supposed to be the right of the eldest Piast male. There have been some depositions, but that was always tied to the abuse of power or political unpopularity of whoever was eldest. That whole system is now out the window. Instead, in its place, we have a group of people deciding that an infant will be Grand Duke of Krakow under a regency. If there's an opposite of eldest PS male, it's infant PS male. The sad outcome of this shift is that Poland effectively ceases to be a unified political unit at this point. Fortunately, as we'll see, institutions like the church and the family relations of the PS meant that the state didn't completely dissolve, but it would be a while before you can honestly point to some borders and say, inside of this area is Poland, outside of this area is not Poland. For those familiar with the broad brushstrokes of history and the trends that you see, you know that times of momentous change in norms and acceptable political practices are often accompanied by violence. That's definitely true of these years in the 1220s. Sons rise against fathers, brothers against brothers, and through it all, there is a sense of continual disintegration. There are some brief highlights, though. One of the biggest is that Krakow gets a boost in prestige in the eyes of the church. Długosz tells us of this event, saying, quote, Bishop Ivo, considering this a favorable time to request the restoration of metropolitan status to Krakow Cathedral, goes to Italy to Pope Gregory IX, his friend since their student days in Paris, whom he finds in Prussia and who readily grants his request. From Prussia, Bishop Ivo goes to Rome to visit the sacred sites. Here he contracts a fever. He leaves before he has thrown it off, and the ardours of travel and the heat of summer make his condition worse. And when he reaches Castelvetro on July 21st, he dies. His friends bury him in the great church in Modena, and a couple of years later the Brethren of the Order of the Dominicans in Krakow, which he founded, remove his bones to the Church of the Holy Trinity in Krakow. End quote. So obviously that's not a great end for Ivo, but it is a great moment for Krakow. I'm not saying that this is some kind of key turning point in Polish history, but being granted the status of metropolitan built on the political centricity of Krakow and created a cultural and religious centricity as well. That role as the center of the Polish state would continue for centuries, providing a unity that was sorely lacking in this era. So that's the internal political state of Poland at this point, which we'll revisit in the next episode. But just because there's a lot of activity happening inside of Poland doesn't mean that the external borders are calm. No, there is trouble abroad, and it is going to have some serious, long-term consequences for Poland. It all has to do with Prussia. Długosz tells us that, quote, the Prussians are behaving with barbarous savagery toward the Poles, making secret and unexpected raids into their territory, burning and carrying people off into slavery. For some time, too, they have been harassing the lands of the Duke of Mazovia, which also border on Prussian territory. Now, on the advice of some wise and pious Cistercians, Duke Conrad sends for 7 brethren of the Teutonic Order of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. End quote. Conrad is facing off against the Prussians, but Conrad needs to be focusing on the internal affairs of the state to make sure that his authority isn't usurped while he's off fighting against the Prussians in the pseudo-crusade happening up north. Getting sick of fighting on 2 fronts, Conrad decides to invite the Teutonic Order to fight in Prussia. I don't believe I've mentioned the Teutonic Order before, so let's take a minute to get the outlines of who these knights were. They are going to be very important. The best description I could find comes to us from Norman Davies' book, God's Playground. Davies tells us that, quote, invited to the country almost casually in 1226, on the private initiative of Conrad of Mazovia, they soon raised the principal threat to the stability and integrity of the Polish lands. They called themselves the Deutschritter, or German Knights, but were known in Poland, from the black cross on their white mantles, as the Krzyżewski, the Black Crusaders. The full name of their organization was the Order of the Hospital of the Blessed Virgin Mary of the German House of Jerusalem, and their adventures in Europe were prompted by the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187 and by the failure of the Third Crusade. Reconstituted as a chivalric order in 1198 with headquarters in Acre, and later in Venice, they loaned their services to any princely ruler who would pay for military help against the unbeliever. In 1224 to 1225, they made a brief appearance in Transylvania and brought themselves to the notice of the Piast princes. At that very moment, Conrad of Mazovia was suffering from a serious shortage of manpower. Already engaged in a major program of conversion and subjugation directed against the pagan Prussian tribes to the north of his borders, he was trying to rule Mazovia, Kujavy, Sirach, and Lychicza, and to bid for the throne of Krakow. When the Prussians responded to his invasions with a salvo of bloody raids and revolts, the minor knightly order, the Brotherhood of Dobrzyń, which he had settled in 1209 on the Prussian frontier, could not cope. Continuing on, Davies tells us that, quote, "The situation was not desperate, but by exaggerating the danger of a Prussian invasion, Conrad was able to justify his appeal to the Teutonic Knights. In 1226 he resolved to invest them with the district of Tromno, and in 1228 the contract was sealed. 2 years later, under their landsman, Hermann von Balk, the knights arrived and began their task with a will." End quote. That all may sound innocent enough, but the Teutonic Order was not there just to fight under Conrad's banner. No, they were there for land, they were there for wealth, they were there for political power, and they were there for those three things in a way that would transcend whatever any one ruling prince said. Part of this was certainly personal desire, but part of it was the realization that if they were going to be viable as a military order, they were going to need a free hand and independence. This was an outgrowth of earlier pro bono fighting that they had done in Hungary. Eric Christensen tells us about this in his book The Northern Crusades, saying, quote, "The Hungarian episode had made Hermann wary. From 1211 to 1225, his men had defended the eastern frontier of Transylvania against the Cumans on the invitation of King Andrew. They had built 5 forts and pacified the region known as the Burgenland. But as soon as they had served their turn, the king accused them of disobeying both him and his bishops and turned them out. Honorius III had protested, but to no avail. Therefore, Hermann decided not to commit the order to fighting the Prussians until he has autonomy." End quote. This autonomy eventually came in a few forms. First, in the Golden Bull of Rimini, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire stated in a document, quote, "The Emperor Frederick II concedes to Hermann, master of the house of St. Mary of the Teutons, and his brothers, the authority to receive the land of Kulm, and all the land which Conrad, Duke of Mazovia and Kujav, promised and offered to the house, and also of invading Prussia and exercising due rights of the emperor without paying any service or tax. March 1226, Rimini." End quote. So that's the emperor giving authority to the Teutonic Order to invade Prussia and keep anything that they conquered. Next up was the Treaty of Kruszwitz, which was signed by Conrad and signed off his claims to the lands that the Teutonic Order conquered. Finally, there was the Pietate Proximum, or Golden Bull of Rieti, which was issued by Pope Gregory IX, granting the same rights as listed above to the Teutonic Order. In the course of a few years, the Teutonic Order had not only established a foothold in Prussia, but established an incredibly secure legal footing on which they could stand. That footing may have been a bit too firm, though. In the years to come, the Teutonic Order would prove to be the bane of Poland's existence. As Długosz tells us, quote, "At the time the grant was made, it appeared sound and justified. But later, when Teutonic Knights try to gain possession of the rest of Poland and the Poles naturally resist, it proves to have been the cause of appalling bloodshed." End quote. That's where we're going to stop for now. Internally, Poland is a bit of a mess. Conrad is nominally in charge of a big part of it, but who knows how firm his grasp is. In the north, the Teutonic Knights have arrived at Conrad's invitation, and in the east, a growing cloud is coming in the form of the Mongols, who have continued to push into Russian lands. All in all, I think the best way to summarize these years is the complete lack of self-awareness of long-term consequences. None of the Piast rulers seemed to realize the long-term consequences of their civil war. Conrad didn't realize the long-term consequences of inviting the Teutonic Order to Prussia, and no one seemed to be aware that there were long-term consequences related to only paying brief attention to the Mongol invasion. We'll pick up all these threads next time. In the meantime, if you enjoy the show, your support on Patreon is deeply appreciated. For a couple of bucks, you get access to exclusive perks, which come out on an ongoing basis. One of these perks is an upcoming series on said Mongol invasion of Europe, which will go into far greater detail than we're going to cover in this podcast. You can listen to that and donate by going to patreon.com/History of Poland podcast. Thanks to everyone who already supports the show. Until then.